I'm going to talk about some results from the Deep Galicia Margin. These are quite fresh results just from the last few months. I guess in a way we're still thinking about what they mean. Lots of people to acknowledge. So most of the material I'm going to show you is from two people from Bhargav Bodupalli, who's just submitted his thesis, and also some work by Richard Davey, which he started in his thesis in Southampton, and then he's done a bit more work on recently. And you'll notice Emma Chambers, who's talking later, gets a mention here as well, because she's contributed to some of this as well. So without further ado, a quick introduction to the Deep Galicia Margin. So this is part of the West Iberia Margin. It's a magma pore margin, and the sediments are relatively thin, just a couple of kilometres. So because of that, we can image rather well tectonic structures in the crust. There's enough sediments to sort of not have lots of scattering, but not too much that the signals are attenuated strongly. And so this is a place where I guess we've learned over the years quite a lot about how the crust deforms in the final stages of continental breakup. And I show here some figures from others who've made important contributions on this margin. And of course, on the Newfoundland side as well, there's good imaging, so one can put together the two conjugates and talk about the whole system. The work I'm going to show you is basically comes from data from the Galicia 3D experiment. So Galicia 3D we did in 2013. It was a big international experiment. We shot a 20 by 80 kilometer box with about 400 meter line spacing, 50 meter CDP spacing, or CDP line spacing, and we put OBSs down at a spacing of about 4 to 6 kilometers. And this one is an experiment that was aiming to image some of the structures I just showed you in 2D and to image those in 3D. And then we deployed OBSs to tell us something about the velocity structure. So, and I mean, there's been a number of papers published on this experiment, and maybe you've seen some of this. So in 2016, we published some results from first arrival tomography, and we had this scheme where basically we found that the mantle velocities are more greatly reduced beneath the intersection of the block bounding faults and this detachment reflector called S. So the velocities were more greatly reduced there than elsewhere, and the amount of velocity reduction when sort of integrated over depth seemed to correspond quite well to, or to correlate quite well with the displacement on the corresponding fault. And then another sort of more recent results, so results starting to emerge from the reflection volume, and this is Gael Lima's paper earlier last year, and what he found was that S is a composite structure, so it's basically made up of the lower parts of a series of block bounding faults. He was able to look at the way those faults move sequentially in groups. So there are groups that kind of move simultaneoly, and then, but overall there's a sort of seaward progression of the deformation. And then also we saw corrugations on the S reflector and also on the block bounding faults that seem to align with each other. So that's stuff you might have seen before, then the rest you won't have seen before because it's all brand new. So 3D waveform inversion. So the idea with 3D waveform inversion is we do a bit better than travel time tomography by actually matching the wiggles of the seismic traces. So we normalize them, we window them, and we low pass filter them to make it a bit more tractable. And then basically by doing a waveform inversion, we go from a resolution that's sort of on the order of the Fresnel zone size, which is around 4 or 5 kilometers for the depth of interest here, to around a wavelength size, which for the frequencies we're using is about 1 kilometre. So we do not quite an order of magnitude improvement, but a big improvement in resolution. So on the left, we've got orange marking observed data and white marking synthetic data. On the left, the travel time model synthetics, and then on the right, the way we improve that with full waveform inversion. So basically, these little mismatches that we see in the travel time model, we've ironed out in the full waveform model. So if we're going to interpret our results, we kind of want to have some confidence that they're kind of real, that the anomalies we're seeing are real, and there are various ways you can test that. And I just show you one of those, which is so-called restoring anomaly test. So what we do is we take our inverted model, we compute synthetics from it, and then we run those synthetics through the full 3D waveform inversion using the same inversion pathway, and we see what we get out at the end. So the top is our final result from our inversion, and the bottom is what we get back out if we go through that process. So you can see they don't match perfectly, but there's a very good match. All the major features are there, and also some of the sort of more minor features appear very well are recovered very well in this test. Another test is sort of to compare with completely different data. And so this is just a comparison with the reflection volume. And what we've done at the top is taken a time slice through the reflection volume, and it's a slice at a time where you intersect the S reflector, this detachment fault. And so that's this trace coming through here. So on the left, we're in the crust, and on the right, we're in the mantle. Below, we've overlain the full waveform inversion velocities, and what we see is this reflection from the reflection volume matches very well a velocity change in the 3D waveform inversion model. So that kind of gives us confidence that with quite high resolution, we are pulling out something real. So some words on interpretation of that model. So I have to be fairly brief, and we're still thinking about what a lot of these things mean, but what we have on here marked in black is the S reflector, in red is the top of the crystalline crust, so the top of those tilted fault blocks, and then in blue is the top of syn rift. But I focus here on the black line. So what we see is that the black line corresponds roughly to a velocity contour. We sort of saw that in the previous slide. The contour it corresponds to is roughly the 6.6 kilometers per second. And then what we see is beneath the footwalls of the fault blocks, we see that that velocity contour, so here and here, shallowing a little bit, and up here and here. So again, we're still thinking about what that means, but perhaps it's the lower crust being present beneath those footwalls of those blocks, and kind of being pulled up with those footwalls. We can make all sorts of slices through our 3D volume. So this is now a slice. Well, the one at the top comes from the reflection volume, and it's just the depth of the S reflector, where it's the crust mantle boundary, or appears to be close to the crust mantle boundary, and below is the velocities on that surface. And what we see is essentially that where there are local highs in the topography, in other words, S is a little bit shallower, we see local lows in velocity. So again, still thinking about what that means, but maybe that's something to do with the buoyancy that results from pentonization. So where the mantle is a little bit less dense, the S is pushed up a little bit. So that's whistle-stop tour through FWI results. The other thing we've done recently is ambient noise cross-correlation, and then using that result to do some tomography at deeper levels. So our OBS array was out for 4 months, We didn't have any broadband seismometers, but the hydrophones are sensitive to periods of up to about 14 seconds. We had some periods when we were shooting the air guns to collect the 3D survey. We had some quieter periods as well. For example, 3 weeks when the ship broke down. It turns out that we can't tell much difference. If we do this cross correlation between periods of shooting or quieter periods, we get pretty much the same results. So we can just throw all the data in. So what this plot shows is essentially all the station pairs with a maximum separation of about 60 kilometers. And you see these surface waves propagating outwards in the cross correlations. And we're interested in those because they tell us about shear wave velocity, which tells us kind of something different about lithology and things like serpentinization. We can do tomography with those results rather than just plot them all together. And then this is Emma's contribution. We can look at checkerboards and see what kind of resolution, and we can certainly resolve at crustal depths around 10 kilometers, maybe less. So then we can compare our, if we've got P-wave velocity from our tomography on the control source data and surface wave velocities from the ambient noise tomography, we can get shear wave velocities and we can compare VP and VS. So here we've got along one transect, west to east through the volume, we've got the P-wave velocity in the top, the S-wave velocity in the middle, and the velocity ratio at the bottom. And then what we've done is picked out from this, so from our travel time tomography with the controlled source data, we have parts of the model that are well resolved and parts that aren't. So the symbols on here, the circles and the squares, mark the cells in the model where both P and S wave velocities are well resolved. So we did that for 3 transects like this, and we looked particularly at the cells just below the S reflector. And then we plotted VP against VS, and there's a lot going on in this diagram, but what we can see is that the ratio increases, so we sort of move to the left as the shear wave velocity decreases. And then if we look at the trends, so the colored trends are from our data, and then we've got some samples from the ocean floor, which define a sort of serpentinized ultramafic trend, the green, and a sort of mafic trend, the grey, and our results from Galicia kind of match better the green than the grey. So our S-wave velocities are kind of consistent with the velocity variations being controlled by variations in degree of serpentinization. So I can't see a clock, unfortunately, but I'll go through the conclusions. If we deploy a dense network of ocean bottom seismometers during a 3D seismic survey, we can learn lots of things. Our NSF reviewers, when we first wrote this proposal, said, oh no, waste of time deploying OBSs, the shot interval's too short, because the shot interval was optimized for the reflection experiment. We can resolve signals down, or we can resolve structures down to length scales of about 1 kilometer with our full waveform inversion, and we can see this sort of significant increase of velocity beneath S. We can see these local variations in velocities above S that might be telling us something about the composition of the crust, and we can see velocity variations at S, which might be telling us something about buoyancy of serpentinized mantle. We can do ambient noise tomography, even though we don't have broadband seismometers, and even though we're making the place very noisy with air guns, and we can resolve structures on length scales of 10 to 15 kilometers, or probably a bit better than that. Our results are consistent with partially serpentinite peridotite lying beneath S at the resolution that we're working at. So on the length, on the resolution of sort of 1 or 2 kilometers that we see beneath S. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. That was excellent. It's really great to see those 3D results coming out. So we've had a couple of questions in. So the first one was from Cindy Ebinger. Cindy, are you there?
Yes, I am. And I just wanted to ask Tim, this is really, really exciting. And those reviewers who poo-pooed were clearly incorrect. But I wanted to ask you, obviously the serpentinization process will leads to a more buoyant mantle and will cause some vertical crustal changes. You know, understanding whether the serpentinization happens in batches and whether there might be some signal or some other test of this interpretation. I'm wondering if there are indications in the overlying sediments of how that process occurs, or if there's any hope of getting that signal.
Well, yeah, of course, in the overlying sediments in general weren't there when a lot of this was happening. I mean, I guess the Sinriff sediments were there for some of it. So yes, that's good. I mean, this is a new result, so we haven't really looked. You know, so that's a nice suggestion. We can look.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. And I think we've got another question from Rich Davey. Rich, do you want to read out your question?
Who did some of this work? Yeah. I'm going to leave this.
No, I was just wondering if there was any plans to do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was wondering if there's any plans to do streamer full waveform inversion, or whether it's too deep in this region. You might be able to get some reflection full waveform inversion done.
So the group in Barcelona were going to do some full waveform inversion on the streamer data, and I haven't heard from them a while. So that's Cesar Aranero. You know, they wrote their own code, and then they were going to apply it to this data set. So obviously that's something we need to link up with again now that we have some results, but we haven't done that yet.
Okay, thanks.
Tim, I had a question about some of the acquisition design. I think I missed it. How closely spaced were your OBS and how long were the streamers?
So this was 4 6-kilometer streamers from the Langseth.
Okay.
But yeah, obviously it's quite deep water. The water depth is 5 kilometers.
Right.
So that sort of limits the FWI on the reflection data. Although, you know, maybe we can combine with the longer offsets. And the OBS spacing was between 4 and 6 kilometers. It was basically about 4 kilometers in an east-west direction and about 6 in a north-south direction. So which we kind of knew was at the limit for doing this. But it's been all right.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's lots of them that we haven't been able to use. So I think we've used about 45 of the 72 that we deployed because of various problems. I mean, some we didn't get back, but some, you know, had clock problems. Some were just a bit noisy.
Right.
You know, they were fine for travel time, but not for waveform. So, but you know, it was enough to make. And I guess also, yeah, the northern line of OBSs, we had to cut. We were unable to complete our 3D box, so the northern bit of this is missing. So the northern line of OBSs is a bit less useful than the rest.
Cool. Okay, thank you.